The call that changed everything lasted less than 5 minutes, but I remember every second of it because my hand was still resting on the proposal folder I had prepared for a meeting I thought was only a formality. My biggest client, the account that had kept my consulting firm alive through 2 difficult years and had finally made me believe I was building something permanent, told me they had decided to move in another direction. My name is Andrea Reinhold, and I learned that the woman I had trusted as my business mentor for almost 10 years had quietly sabotaged my most important client relationship so she could take the account for herself. Not after a failed project, not after missed deadlines, not after a pricing dispute. They were leaving because they had concerns about my firm's stability, concerns they said had recently come to their attention from someone they trusted. At first I was confused, then I was hurt. Then, a few days later, when a colleague told me she had overheard part of a conversation between my former mentor and that same client, confusion turned into something colder. Her name was Bernadette Keller, though everyone called her Bernie, and for years I would have described her as one of the most important professional influences in my life. I met her when I was 28, newly promoted, ambitious, and trying not to show how overwhelmed I was in rooms full of people who had more money, more experience, and more confidence than I did. Bernie was 15 years older than me, polished without being cold, blunt without being cruel, and experienced in exactly the kind of operational strategy work I wanted to build my career around. She had started her own advisory firm after leaving a corporate leadership role, and she had a reputation for knowing how to win clients without sounding desperate, how to price work without apologizing, and how to walk into a boardroom as though she belonged there. When she took an interest in me, I felt lucky. She reviewed my early proposals, coached me before difficult meetings, told me which mistakes would cost me credibility, and reminded me more than once that being liked was not the same thing as being respected. For years, I believed she wanted me to succeed because she saw something in me. Looking back, that belief is the part that still aches, because for a long time there was real generosity in the relationship, or at least something that looked enough like generosity that I built trust on top of it. When I eventually left my corporate position and started my own small consulting firm in Portland, Bernie was one of the first people I called. She helped me think through service packages, warned me not to undercharge, introduced me to 2 accountants, and even sat with me over coffee while I panicked about signing my first office lease. She said, "Andrea, if you want clients to trust you with big problems, you have to stop presenting yourself like a temporary solution." I wrote that sentence down in a notebook because it felt like advice from someone who had already survived the road I was just beginning. My firm started small. It was just me, then me and a contractor, then me and 2 employees, then a team of 5 handling workflow audits, operations redesign, vendor transitions, and growth planning for mid-sized companies that were too big for informal systems and too small for giant consulting firms. I was not rich, and I was not famous, but I was proud. I had built a business that paid salaries, served real clients, and carried my name without embarrassing me. The account that changed the scale of my firm was Westbridge Home Supply, a regional company with distribution centers across Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. They were not glamorous, but they were solid, growing, and extremely demanding in the way good clients can be demanding. Their chief operating officer, Daniel Mercer, first hired me for a narrow vendor review after a referral from a controller I had worked with. That first project went well. Then they asked us to help restructure warehouse reporting. Then they asked for a 6-month operations improvement plan. By the second year, Westbridge represented almost 30% of my firm's annual revenue. That number was exciting and terrifying. I knew enough to understand that relying too heavily on one client was risky, but I also knew that landing and keeping a client like that gave my firm credibility. When I spoke to Bernie about Westbridge, I was careful at first, then gradually more open. She knew the broad scope of the work. She knew how important the account was. She knew which internal leaders were skeptical, which ones supported me, and which upcoming renewal meeting mattered most. She knew because I told her. I told her because I trusted her. I thought I was getting mentorship. I did not understand I was handing her a map. The renewal meeting was scheduled for a Thursday morning in late April. It was supposed to cover a new 12-month agreement, expanded support for 2 distribution centers, and a leadership workshop series for regional managers. I had spent 3 weeks preparing. My operations lead, Naomi Price, had built updated performance dashboards. My analyst, Kira Shelton, had organized before and after metrics showing reductions in order processing delays. I had rehearsed the financial section twice because I wanted Daniel to see that our work had more than paid for itself. 2 days before the meeting, Daniel's assistant emailed to say they needed to postpone. That was not unusual. Westbridge executives moved meetings often, and I assumed something internal had come up. Then Thursday passed. Then Friday. The following Monday, Daniel called me directly. His tone was polite, but it had a careful distance I had never heard from him before. He said, "Andrea, I wanted you to hear this from me and not through procurement. We have decided not to renew the contract at this time." I remember glancing at my desk calendar because my brain refused to accept the sentence as real. I asked if there had been a problem with our work. He said no, the work had been strong. I asked if it was budget. He said budget was part of every decision, but not the primary reason. Then he said the phrase that made my stomach drop. He said they had concerns about my firm's stability and capacity to support them through the next phase. I asked what he meant by stability. He paused. Then he said, "There are indications you may be under more strain than we realized. We cannot afford a disruption midstream." I told him my firm was stable, that our staffing plan for Westbridge was complete, and that nothing had changed operationally. He said he respected me, but the decision had been made. I asked if we could meet and talk through the concerns. He said, "Not right now." When the call ended, I sat at my desk for a long time without moving. Naomi came in and asked how it went, and I could barely get the words out. Losing Westbridge was not just disappointing, it was dangerous. We had other clients, but none at that scale. I had made hiring decisions assuming the renewal would happen because every signal from Westbridge had pointed that way. I had not signed anything I could not cover, but the next 6 months would become tight, and I knew I might have to delay growth plans, cut contractor hours, and spend every waking moment replacing revenue I thought was secure. Still, at that point, I did not suspect Bernie. That matters. I did not immediately leap to betrayal. I thought maybe Daniel had heard a rumor from a competitor. Maybe someone at Westbridge misunderstood something I had said about cash flow management. Maybe my small firm simply looked fragile compared with larger advisory groups. I was embarrassed, frightened, and angry, but I was not yet ready to accuse anyone, least of all the woman who had sat across from me for years, telling me how to protect the business I was building. 3 days later, my colleague Elise Harrow called me. Elise ran a boutique HR compliance firm, and we had shared clients before. She was not dramatic. If anything, she was careful to the point of understatement. She asked if I had time for a private conversation, and her voice made me close my office door. She said, "I am not sure what to do with this, but I think you need to know." I was at the Sentinel Club on Tuesday for a lunch meeting, and I heard Bernie Keller talking with someone from Westbridge. The Sentinel Club was a private downtown business club where consultants, executives, attorneys, and bankers liked to pretend they were not networking while absolutely networking. Bernie used it often. I asked Elise what she heard. She said she had not heard the entire conversation, only enough to make her uncomfortable. Bernie had been speaking with a man Elise recognized as someone from Westbridge leadership, though she did not know his name. Elise heard my name. Then she heard Bernie say something about my firm being stretched thin, about cash reserves being a concern, and about Westbridge needing continuity. Elise said Bernie lowered her voice after that, and Elise did not want to hover like she was spying, but the timing bothered her once she heard through a mutual contact that Westbridge had not renewed with me. I felt heat rise in my face while she spoke. I asked if she was certain Bernie used my name. Elise said yes. I asked if she might have misunderstood the context. Maybe Bernie was defending me. Elise was quiet for a second, then said, "Andrea, I wish that were true. It did not sound like defense." Even then, I resisted the conclusion. I thanked Elise and told her I needed to understand more before I did anything. After we hung up, I walked around my office with my phone in my hand, replaying every recent conversation I had had with Bernie. There had been one coffee meeting 3 weeks earlier where I told her I was nervous about the Westbridge renewal because the account was so important. She had asked detailed questions. How much revenue did they represent? Was Daniel still the final decision maker? Were they considering bigger firms? Did I have enough staff to support the expanded work? At the time, those questions seemed like normal mentor questions. She had told me not to let fear show in the meeting. She had even said, "You have earned that room." I had left feeling steadier. Now every question had a different edge. I called Daniel the next morning. I kept my voice calm because I knew sounding wounded would not help. I told him I respected his decision, but I wanted to understand the concerns about stability because if there were inaccurate perceptions in the market, I needed to address them. Daniel was guarded at first. He said he could not disclose every internal discussion. I said I was not asking for confidential deliberations. I was asking whether Westbridge's decision had been influenced by claims that my firm was in financial distress. There was a pause long enough for me to hear the air system in my office kick on. Then Daniel said, "Andrea, I do not want to get into a back and forth." I said, "I understand. But if someone told you we were missing payroll, losing staff, or struggling to remain solvent, those statements are false." Another pause. Then he said, "Those specific concerns were raised, yes." My heart started pounding. Missing payroll, losing staff, solvency. Those were not vague worries. Those were specific allegations. I asked who raised them. Daniel would not say. He said the information came through a trusted professional contact and that Westbridge had to evaluate risk. I told him my firm had never missed payroll, had not lost key staff, and was not insolvent. I offered to provide financial confirmation from my accountant under a confidentiality agreement. He sounded uncomfortable. He said, "I hear you, Andrea. But we have already engaged another advisory partner for the transition." I asked who. He hesitated, then said, "Keller Strategic Group." For a second I could not speak. Keller Strategic Group was Bernie's firm. I had expected pain, but not that clean a confirmation. I thanked him for his time and ended the call before my voice broke. Then I sat in my office and stared at the wall while the whole shape of it settled around me. Bernie had not merely criticized me. She had warned my biggest client that my business was unstable, and then she had positioned herself as the solution. That was not mentorship gone sour. That was a targeted raid. I called my attorney, Priscilla Nakamura, that afternoon. Priscilla had helped me review contracts when I started the firm, and she had a calm, precise way of asking questions that made panic feel less useful. I told her everything: the lost renewal, Daniel's comments, Elise's overheard conversation, and the fact that Westbridge had engaged Bernie's firm. Priscilla did not jump to conclusions, but she did not minimize it either. She asked whether Bernie had access to confidential information about Westbridge or my firm. I said she had informal knowledge through mentorship conversations, not documents under a formal NDA, but enough to know the account value, staffing concerns, timeline, and decision makers. Priscilla said, "The legal question will depend on proof. Hurtful behavior is one thing, tortious interference is another. We need evidence that she knowingly made false statements or improperly interfered with an existing business relationship." I asked what that meant practically. She said we needed to confirm communications, timing, content, and damages. She recommended a private investigator named Marisol Vance, someone she had used in business disputes where reputation and client relationships were involved. I imagined private investigators as people following cheating spouses in movies, but Marisol was not like that. She was a former corporate fraud examiner with a quiet voice, gray streaks in her black hair, and a talent for making people underestimate how much she noticed. We met in Priscilla's conference room 2 days later. Marisol asked me to build a timeline from memory. When did I last discuss Westbridge with Bernie? What exactly did I tell her? When was the renewal meeting scheduled? When did Westbridge postpone? When did Daniel terminate? When did Keller Strategic Group begin work? Who might have emails, calendar entries, meeting invitations, or messages? She told me she could not magically access private records, and she would not do anything illegal, but in business disputes there were often legitimate ways to establish facts: witness interviews, public filings, vendor records, calendar trails, communications preserved by parties willing or required to produce them, and later, if litigation began, discovery. She also asked me for something I had not expected: copies of my own messages with Bernie. I sent them while sitting there. There were texts where I mentioned Westbridge's renewal date, emails where Bernie gave general advice, a message from me saying, "I am nervous they will think we are too small for the next phase." Her reply came back in my phone history like a little knife: "They know your value. Do not let size become the story." That was exactly the story she had apparently made sure they heard. The investigation took several weeks, and those weeks were some of the hardest of my professional life. Outwardly, I had to keep running the firm. I met with staff, reassured them without oversharing, reviewed cash flow, and shifted workloads. I told Naomi and Kira that Westbridge had not renewed, and that we were adjusting the pipeline. Naomi knew me well enough to ask, "Is this just business, or is there something else?" I told her there might be something else, but I could not discuss it yet. I hated that answer. I hated watching my employees worry because another consultant had decided my success was inconvenient. I cut my own pay temporarily before touching anyone else's hours. I called former clients. I followed up on proposals I had been too busy to chase. I woke at 3 a.m. with my mind doing math: receivables, payroll, rent, insurance, taxes, contractor invoices. During the day, I sounded composed. At night, I felt foolish. I kept hearing Bernie's voice from years earlier saying that relationships were the foundation of consulting. She was right, she had used that foundation against me. Marisol moved carefully. She interviewed Elise and took a detailed statement about what Elise had overheard at the Sentinel Club. Elise confirmed the date, approximate time, seating arrangement, and the phrases she remembered. Marisol then identified the Westbridge executive at the lunch as Martin Vale, the senior vice president of procurement, who had influence over outside advisory contracts. Martin was not Daniel, but he was exactly the kind of person who could push a risk concern into the internal conversation. Marisol also learned through a mutual industry contact that Bernie had been telling people she had won a major regional supply chain client after helping them avoid a continuity issue with a smaller provider. That phrase, continuity issue, made my skin crawl. It was polished enough to sound professional and vague enough to avoid immediate challenge. Priscilla sent a preservation letter to Bernie and Keller Strategic Group, instructing them to preserve communications related to Westbridge and my firm. Bernie did not respond personally. Her attorney did, with the predictable language that Keller Strategic Group denied wrongdoing and would preserve relevant materials. Priscilla also sent a letter to Westbridge, not accusing them but notifying them that false statements may have influenced their decision and asking them to preserve communications with Keller Strategic Group. Daniel called me after receiving it. He sounded irritated and embarrassed. He said, "Andrea, I thought we were handling this professionally." I said, "Daniel, I am trying to. But someone told you my firm was financially unstable, and that was false." Then that same person took the account. I cannot ignore that. He said Westbridge had acted in its own best interest. I said I understood his responsibility to protect the company, but I had a responsibility to protect mine too. That call ended politely but not warmly. I knew any chance of simply winning Westbridge back was fading. The damage had already moved from contract terms into trust, and trust does not return just because a spreadsheet says it should. The first real break came from a person I had never met. A Westbridge finance manager named Sienna Ortiz contacted Priscilla after hearing internally that there might be a dispute. Sienna had worked with my team on invoice approvals and had always been pleasant, but I did not know her beyond routine communication. She told Priscilla she was uncomfortable because she had been asked to pull copies of my firm's payment history after a senior executive said there were concerns that we might be using Westbridge payments to cover overdue payroll. Sienna said the request seemed strange because Westbridge had always paid us on standard terms, and there had been no billing irregularities. More importantly, she had seen an email chain printed for a meeting packet. In that chain, Bernie had written to Martin Vale, saying my firm was facing internal cash pressure, had delayed compensation to staff, and was not positioned to support Westbridge's expansion without disruption. Sienna did not have authority to hand over company documents casually, and Priscilla did not ask her to violate policy, but Sienna's statement gave us a precise target. There was an email, there were specific false claims, there was a recipient and a date. Priscilla used that information to draft a more formal demand. Once Westbridge realized the issue might become litigation involving their decision process, their legal department became more cooperative, not out of kindness but self-protection. They did not want to be accused of ignoring false statements or participating in unfair interference. Through attorneys, Westbridge eventually produced a limited set of communications under a confidentiality agreement. I was in Priscilla's office when she received them. She read silently for a few minutes, then looked up at me with an expression that made my stomach tighten. She said, "It is there." The email from Bernie to Martin was dated 2 days before my renewal meeting was postponed. It was written in the smooth, concerned tone I knew so well. Bernie said she was reaching out discreetly because she respected Westbridge and did not want them exposed to operational disruption. She claimed she had reason to believe Reinhold Advisory was under serious cash pressure, that I had been delaying compensation discussions with employees, and that my team was stretched beyond capacity. She wrote that she admired my talent but worried I had grown too quickly and might not be transparent with clients because I was afraid of losing them. Then, after poisoning the water, she added that Keller Strategic Group had the bench strength to step in if Westbridge needed a more stable partner. Reading it felt physically strange, as if my body had gone cold from the inside. The betrayal was not loud, it was elegant. It sounded like concern. It sounded like a senior woman protecting a client from a younger woman who had gotten in over her head. That was what made it so dangerous. Bernie had not written, "Andrea is incompetent." That would have been easy to dismiss. She had written, "I admire Andrea, but I am worried." She used affection as packaging for sabotage. There were more messages. Martin replied asking whether Bernie had direct knowledge. Bernie responded that she had mentored me for years and had watched my firm struggle with the pressure of rapid growth. She said she could not reveal every private conversation, but she felt ethically obligated to alert Westbridge before they expanded the relationship. That sentence made Priscilla mutter something under her breath for the first and only time in our meetings. Bernie had taken the confidentiality implied by mentorship and twisted it into authority. She had made it seem as though she was reluctantly sharing insider knowledge for Westbridge's protection, when in reality she was using private access to fabricate credibility. Another email, sent the day after the postponed meeting, proposed a transition plan from my firm to hers. It included an aggressive start date and a fee structure slightly lower than mine for the first 3 months, then higher after the transition period. She had been ready. She had not stumbled into an opportunity. She had built the bridge before she burned mine. Marisol's final report organized everything into a timeline. My mentorship conversations with Bernie, the upcoming renewal, Bernie's lunch with Martin, the false email, the postponement, Westbridge's internal risk discussion, the non-renewal call, and Keller Strategic Group's engagement. She also documented that my firm had not missed payroll, had not lost key staff, and had current financial records contradicting Bernie's claims. My accountant provided a letter confirming payroll history and cash position without revealing unnecessary private details. Naomi and Kira signed statements that compensation had not been delayed and that staffing for Westbridge's expansion had been planned. The evidence did not erase the damage, but it changed the ground beneath my feet. I was no longer trying to convince myself I was not paranoid. I was looking at proof. Priscilla advised me not to confront Bernie alone, but I needed to hear her voice. Maybe that was foolish. Maybe it was human. We arranged a meeting through attorneys, officially framed as a settlement discussion. It took place in a conference room at Priscilla's office. Bernie arrived with her lawyer, wearing a cream blazer and the same calm expression she used to wear when she told me to stop apologizing before making a point. Seeing her there was worse than I expected. Part of me wanted her to look guilty. Part of me wanted her to look ashamed. Instead, she looked inconvenienced. Priscilla opened by summarizing the evidence. Bernie's attorney said they disputed the characterization. Bernie herself said nothing at first. Then Priscilla placed the email in front of her and asked whether she had written it. Bernie said, "I did." Priscilla asked whether she had evidence that my firm had missed payroll or was insolvent. Bernie said, "That is not exactly what I said." I leaned forward and said, "You said I was under serious cash pressure and might not be transparent with clients. You said my team was at risk of disruption. You knew that was false." Her eyes finally moved to mine. For a moment I saw something like irritation crack through the polished surface. She said, "Andrea, you were always emotional about that account. You told me yourself you were nervous about capacity." I said, "Being nervous before a major renewal is not the same thing as being unstable." She said, "Clients have a right to know when a provider may be overextended." I said, "Then why did you offer your firm as the alternative in the same conversation?" Her attorney touched her arm, a warning. Bernie looked away. Priscilla kept going, calm and relentless. She asked why Bernie had not advised me to disclose any supposed concerns to Westbridge if she genuinely believed there was a risk. She asked why Bernie had not asked my permission before sharing information supposedly drawn from private mentorship conversations. She asked why Keller Strategic Group's transition proposal was drafted within 24 hours of the false warning. Bernie denied intent for almost an hour. She said she had acted out of concern. She said Westbridge made its own choice. She said the consulting market was competitive. Then Priscilla brought up a message Marisol had obtained through lawful discovery after the claim was filed. A message Bernie had sent to a senior associate in her own firm. In it, Bernie wrote, "Andrea landed Westbridge too early and cannot hold them if they get spooked. We may have a window if Martin understands the risk." It was not as explicit as a confession, but it was close enough to change the air in the room. Bernie's face tightened. Her attorney asked for a break. When they returned, Bernie did not fully apologize. People like her rarely do at first. But she stopped pretending the whole thing had been innocent. She said quietly, "I was frustrated watching you get opportunities my firm had been chasing for years." I stared at her. She continued, "I helped you. I opened doors for you. Then you started competing in the same space." I said, "You told me to build in that space." She said, "I did not expect you to move that fast." That was the closest she came in that room to the truth. Envy had been sitting beside mentorship, maybe for months, maybe longer. My growth had stopped feeling like her legacy and started feeling like her competition. Instead of telling me, instead of stepping back, instead of competing honestly, she used what she knew about my fears to make them sound like facts. I asked her one question that had nothing to do with the legal claim. I said, "When I came to you scared about that renewal, did you already know you were going to approach them?" She did not answer. She did not have to. The case did not go to trial. Priscilla prepared a claim for tortious interference with my business relationship, business defamation, and related damages. Bernie's attorney understood the risk. The emails were damaging, the timing was clear, and a trial would put her reputation under a light she could not control. Westbridge, for its part, wanted distance from the fight. They provided limited cooperation, maintained that they had made an independent business decision, and quietly ended Keller Strategic Group's transition engagement earlier than planned. They did not immediately return to my firm. That was one of the hardest lessons. Proving that someone lied about you does not automatically restore what the lie broke. Daniel eventually met with me in person. He looked tired. He said Westbridge should have asked me directly before acting on Bernie's claims. I appreciated the admission, but it did not undo the lost contract. He said they had concerns about becoming involved in a dispute. I said, "Daniel, you became involved the moment you accepted a competitor's private warning about my business without letting me respond." He nodded, and to his credit, he did not argue. Westbridge later hired us for a smaller, clearly defined project after their internal leadership changed, but the big renewal never came back in its original form. By then, I had stopped waiting for it. The settlement with Bernie included financial damages tied to the value of the lost client relationship, reimbursement for investigative and legal costs, a written retraction to Westbridge, and a non-disparagement agreement with specific language prohibiting her and her firm from making statements about my firm's financial stability, staffing, or capacity without documented basis. The settlement was confidential in some details, but the retraction was not private between the necessary parties. Bernie had to state in writing that she did not have evidence that my firm had missed payroll, delayed compensation, or lacked financial capacity to serve Westbridge at the time of her communications. That mattered to me more than I expected. Money helped stabilize the firm, but the retraction addressed the poison directly. I wanted the lie named as a lie. I wanted the people who had heard it to know it had no foundation. When the settlement was signed, I thought I would feel triumphant. I did not. I felt exhausted. I went home that evening, sat on my kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets, and cried harder than I had cried when Westbridge first left. The crisis part was ending, and that meant I finally had room to grieve the relationship itself. Bernie had been at my first firm anniversary dinner. She had sent flowers when I hired my first full-time employee. She had written me a note after my father died, telling me he would have been proud of what I was building. Those memories did not disappear just because she betrayed me. They became complicated, and that complication was its own kind of pain. I kept asking myself whether I had missed signs. There were some, if I forced myself to look. Her compliments had become sharper over the last year. When I told her about Westbridge expanding our scope, she said, "That is a lot for a firm your size." When I mentioned hiring Naomi, she said, "Be careful growing before your systems mature." Those comments were not wrong on their face. A mentor should challenge you. But there had been a tone I ignored because I wanted the relationship to remain what it had been. I also realized how much informal mentorship relies on trust without structure. I had treated Bernie like a safe place to think out loud. I discussed fears, revenue concentration, staffing pressure, and client politics as though she were inside my circle. But she was also a market participant. She ran a firm in an overlapping space. She had incentives. I had blurred the line because the relationship felt personal. She exploited that blur because it gave her access without accountability. Marisol said something to me after she closed her investigation that has stayed with me. We were in Priscilla's office, and she was handing over the final report. She said mentor sabotage hurts differently because the mentor already knows where the story will sound believable. A stranger could have said your firm was unstable, and the client might have questioned it. Bernie knew exactly which fear to dress up as a fact. That was the most accurate description I heard. Bernie did not invent a random attack. She took the normal vulnerability of a growing business and sharpened it into a weapon. Every small firm has moments of strain. Every founder worries about capacity, cash flow, hiring, concentration, and reputation. The existence of those worries does not mean the business is failing. It means the business is alive. Bernie knew that. She counted on Westbridge not knowing the difference. Rebuilding after the settlement was slower than I wanted and steadier than I feared. I kept Naomi and Kira. I was honest with them once the legal process allowed me to be, and their anger on my behalf was both comforting and humbling. Naomi said, "I knew something about that loss smelled wrong." Kira, who was younger and usually quiet in tense conversations, said, I am glad you did not just absorb it and move on. That sentence hit me because there had been moments when absorbing it seemed easier. Fighting required money, time, and emotional energy I did not feel I had. It also required me to admit publicly, at least within a professional circle, that I had been betrayed by someone I trusted. There is shame in being deceived, even though there should not be. I had to remind myself repeatedly that the shame belonged to the person who lied, not the person who believed a mentor was acting in good faith. We diversified our client base after that, not in a panicked way, but with discipline. I stopped allowing any single account to become so large that losing it could threaten payroll. I changed how I discuss client details with outside advisors. I still seek advice, but I separate emotional processing from strategic disclosure. If someone is not under a formal advisory agreement, with confidentiality terms and no competitive conflict, they do not get sensitive client information. That may sound obvious, but many founders learn it late because entrepreneurship can be lonely. When someone experienced offers guidance, you want to believe the relationship is protected by goodwill. Sometimes it is. Sometimes goodwill lasts only until your success becomes inconvenient. I also rebuilt my professional network with more care. I found mentors outside my direct service category. I joined a peer group where every member signed confidentiality commitments and conflicts were disclosed. I became more deliberate about documenting client communications, especially around renewals and performance results. Not because I wanted to live defensively, but because clarity protects good work. If Westbridge had asked for a formal stability review before making its decision, I could have answered every concern in a day. The problem was not that my firm lacked proof. The problem was that the lie reached the decision-makers through a trusted side door before I even knew a question had been raised. About 8 months after the settlement, I saw Bernie at an industry breakfast. I had known it might happen eventually. Portland's business community is not as large as people think. She was standing near the coffee table, speaking with two people I recognized. When she saw me, her expression shifted, just slightly. The old version of me might have walked over, hoping for closure or an apology that sounded like the woman I used to know. Instead, I poured coffee, nodded once, and walked to my table. My hands shook a little, but I did not give her a conversation. That was my closure. Not forgiveness, not revenge, not a dramatic confrontation. Just the refusal to keep performing closeness with someone who had treated my trust as a business opportunity. Later, I heard that Keller Strategic Group lost a few referral relationships after the truth circulated quietly through the right channels. I did not campaign against her. I did not need to. In professional communities, reputation moves through patterns. People may forgive a tough competitor. They may even respect one. But someone who weaponizes private mentorship to steal a client becomes dangerous in a way other professionals remember. The irony is that Bernie taught me that too. Years earlier she told me, "Your reputation is not what you say in the room. It is what people believe about you after you leave." She was right again, just not in the way she intended. I still think about Westbridge sometimes, especially when I review our current client roster and see how different the firm became because of that loss. In a strange way, the crisis forced me to build a healthier business. We became less dependent, more documented, more selective, and more confident about the value we delivered. But I do not romanticize what happened. I do not say it was a blessing. It was betrayal. And betrayal does not need to be redeemed to be survived. The lesson was not that everything happens for a reason. The lesson was that when something feels wrong, you are allowed to look closely. You are allowed to ask direct questions. You are allowed to protect what you built, even when the person threatening it once helped you build it. For a long time, I thought loyalty meant assuming the best until the evidence was undeniable. Now I think loyalty also includes being loyal to yourself, to your employees, to the facts, and to the business that carries other people's livelihoods. If I had dismissed Elise's warning because accusing Bernie felt too painful, the false story might have hardened into accepted truth. If I had accepted Daniel's vague explanation without pressing for specifics, I might never have learned how deliberate it was. If Priscilla had not insisted on evidence, and Marisol had not built the timeline piece by piece, Bernie could have walked away with my client and my silence. She did not. That matters. My relationship with Bernie ended completely, and I no longer try to separate the mentor I loved from the competitor who harmed me. They were the same person. That is the difficult truth. She gave me real advice, and she also chose to betray me. She helped me grow, and then resented the growth. She knew my fears because I trusted her with them, and then she used those fears to make a client doubt me. I cannot make that neat. I can only tell it honestly. If you were in my position, would you have confronted your mentor sooner, or would you have waited for proof the way I did? Would you have tried to win the client back after learning they believed the lie, or would you have walked away from them too? I still wonder what other people would have done with the same mix of anger, grief, and responsibility. Share your thoughts, especially if you have ever had someone close to your career turn your trust into leverage. Thank you for listening to my story. If this kind of real workplace betrayal, business conflict, and hard-earned accountability speaks to you, subscribe for more stories like this. I hope wherever you are listening from, you protect your work, choose your advisors carefully, and remember that your success should never have to apologize for making someone else uncomfortable.